Thomas Jenkins felt his heart race as he turned the key in the lock of his new home for the first time. The charming colonial on a corner lot in Willowbrook Estates represented 15 years of overtime shifts and careful saving. Sunlight streamed through bay windows onto hardwood floors as he walked room to room, planning where each piece of furniture would go. The real prize waited outside, a sprawling backyard framed by century-old oak trees, where he imagined hosting summer barbecues and quiet morning coffees. "This is mine," he whispered to himself, running his hand along the kitchen countertop. Each surface in the house was immaculate, meeting the strict standards of Willowbrook Estates. His realtor had emphasized the well-maintained neighborhood standards as justification for the steep HOA fees. But standing in his very own kitchen, Thomas decided it seemed worth every penny. That evening, he sat on his porch swing with a celebratory glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in gold. Residents walked their dogs, waved to each other, and tended to flower beds with careful attention. Thomas felt a sense of accomplishment that warmed him more than the wine. He had finally arrived. The welcome basket appeared on his doorstep the following morning. It contained local honey, artisanal bread, and a thick binder emblazoned with Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association in gold lettering. Thomas spent his first Sunday as a homeowner poring over the regulations while unpacking boxes. Most rules seemed reasonable. Restrictions on exterior paint colors, requirements for lawn maintenance, guidelines for holiday decorations. He made careful notes, determined to be a model resident. His first encounter with a neighbor came when he was struggling to unload a heavy bookshelf from his moving truck. "Need a hand with that?" called a friendly voice. A man about Thomas's age jogged over from across the street. "I'm David Chen. My wife and I have lived here for about 3 years." Together, they maneuvered the bookshelf inside, and David helped with a few more heavy pieces before accepting Thomas's offer of a cold beer on the porch. "So you've met anyone else in the neighborhood yet?" David asked, leaning back in his chair. "Not yet," Thomas replied, "though I have received the HOA welcome package. Quite comprehensive." Something flickered across David's expression. "Ah yes, the famous rulebook. Just be careful about." He stopped as a silver Mercedes pulled into the driveway 3 doors down. "That's Margaret Winters. She's the HOA president." Thomas watched as an elegant woman in her 50s emerged from the car, designer sunglasses perched on her nose. She noticed them looking and offered a perfunctory wave. "I should probably introduce myself," Thomas said. "Good luck," David murmured with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "She takes the rules very seriously." 2 days later, Thomas attended his first neighborhood gathering at the community clubhouse. Residents clustered in groups, chatting over wine and cheese. Thomas introduced himself to several friendly couples, before finally meeting Margaret, who stood surveying the room like a general overlooking troops. "Welcome to Willowbrook," she said with a smile that seemed practiced rather than warm. Her handshake was firm, her pearl necklace catching the light as she tilted her head. "I trust you've reviewed our community guidelines." "Yes, very thoroughly," Thomas assured her. "Beautiful neighborhood you have here. I'm looking forward to settling in." "We expect all residents to maintain our standards," Margaret replied. "The value of all our properties depends on it." Something in her tone made Thomas wonder if he passed or failed some unspoken test. As she moved away to greet someone else, he caught David's eye across the room. His new neighbor gave him a subtle nod that somehow felt like both a warning and a welcome to what lay ahead in Willowbrook Estates. April sunshine coaxed Thomas outdoors to begin his dream project, a vegetable garden that would provide fresh produce all summer. He spent hours researching heirloom tomato varieties and designing an efficient watering system. The satisfying thud of his shovel breaking ground felt like pure freedom. By sunset on the 3rd day, his raised cedar beds took elegant shape in the far corner of his yard, completely hidden from street view. Thomas stood back to admire his work, dirt smudged across his forehead, muscles pleasantly sore from the labor. He positioned the garden beds precisely where they would receive optimal sunlight while remaining invisible from the road. The cedar frames, which he had meticulously sanded and sealed, gleamed with a warm honey color against the spring grass. He envisioned summer mornings harvesting dewy vegetables before breakfast. "Looks like you've been busy," called David from over the fence. "Garden coming along nicely." Thomas waved him over. "Come see the layout. I'm thinking tomatoes here, zucchini along this side, and herbs in the smaller beds." David examined the construction with appreciation, but glanced over his shoulder before speaking. "Did you get this approved by the HOA?" Thomas paused, trowel in hand. "For a vegetable garden? It's not even visible from the street. Technically, any structure needs prior approval," David explained, making air quotes around the word structure. "They consider raised beds to be structures." "That seems excessive for something temporary and in my backyard," Thomas replied, frowning. "I read through all the guidelines. There was nothing specific about gardens." "Welcome to the gray areas of Willowbrook," David said with a shrug. "Margaret has a way of finding rules when she wants to." Thomas thanked him for the heads up but continued his work, certain that no reasonable person would object to such a tasteful addition to private property. He completed the final bed just as the sun was setting, stepping back to admire his creation with satisfaction. The knock on his door came precisely at 8 o'clock the next morning. Margaret Winters stood on his porch clutching a leather portfolio, her pearl earrings catching the morning light. Behind her stood a thin man in pressed khakis holding a digital camera. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," Margaret said, the crisp formality of her tone contrasting with the warmth of the spring morning. "I understand you constructed unauthorized structures in your backyard." Thomas blinked in confusion. "They're just raised garden beds for vegetables." Section 7, Paragraph 3 clearly addresses exterior modifications, she stated, flipping open her portfolio to a highlighted page. "All structures require prior board approval." "I wouldn't consider garden beds to be structures," Thomas countered politely. "They're not permanent installations." Margaret's smile tightened. "Anything built or installed is considered a structure under our guidelines. This is Carl Peterson, our compliance officer. We need to document the unauthorized construction." Thomas reluctantly led them through his home to the backyard, watching as Carl photographed his carefully crafted beds from multiple angles. Margaret made notes in her portfolio, her expression revealing nothing. "You'll need to submit a formal application for these," she informed him, handing him a multi-page form. "The board will review it at our next meeting. Until then, no planting should occur in these unauthorized structures." "But the growing season," Thomas began. "Rules exist for everyone's benefit, Mr. Jenkins," Margaret interrupted. "Your application will be processed like anyone else's." As they left, Thomas noticed Margaret pausing to speak with an older woman walking her dog. Both glanced back at his house, and the woman shook her head disapprovingly. Thomas completed the application that evening, including detailed drawings, materials lists, and even a property survey marking the garden's location. He hand-delivered it to the HOA office the next morning, where the secretary assured him the board would review it promptly. 2 weeks later, a thin envelope arrived in his mailbox. The rejection notice offered no explanation beyond inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetic standards. Through his kitchen window, Thomas could see his empty cedar beds, waiting for plants that might never come. The HOA meeting buzzed with whispered conversations that fell silent when Thomas entered the community center. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where board members arranged papers and water bottles. Thomas nodded to a few familiar faces, including David, who gave him an encouraging thumbs up from the back row. Thomas had prepared meticulously for his appeal, creating a folder with photographs of his garden beds, alongside similar structures he had discovered throughout the neighborhood. He had spent an entire Saturday walking Willowbrook Estates, documenting no fewer than 7 properties with raised garden beds, including one belonging to board member Richard Steinman. When the meeting moved to new business, Thomas raised his hand and approached the podium when acknowledged. He spoke clearly, presenting his case with calm logic rather than the frustration he felt. "As you can see from these images," he explained, displaying his photographs, "my garden beds are consistent with others already approved in our community. They're well constructed, aesthetically pleasing, and completely hidden from street view." From his position at the microphone, Thomas could see the board members' reactions. 2 examined his photos with interest, 1 stared blankly at his phone, and Margaret maintained the neutral expression that revealed nothing. Only Richard Steinman, whose own garden appeared in Thomas's documentation, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Jenkins," Margaret said when he finished. "We'll take a vote on your appeal." She turned to the board members. "All in favor of approving Mr. Jenkins's garden structure?" One hand, belonging to elderly Mr. Rosenberg, raised hesitantly. All opposed. 4 hands rose without hesitation. "Motion denied," Margaret announced, moving swiftly to the next agenda item without further explanation. The single supporting vote came from elderly Mr. Rosenberg, who patted Thomas's shoulder afterward, murmuring, "Don't take it personally, son. Sometimes it's just about who's asking." Thomas drove home with a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with the garden itself and everything to do with the unfairness of the process. What rule could possibly justify approving identical structures for some residents while denying others? The morning brought fresh frustration in the form of a violation notice tucked into his doorframe. According to the citation, his trash receptacles had been visible from the street for more than the permitted 12 hours. Thomas frowned, certain he had rolled them behind his gate immediately after collection, the previous afternoon. 2 days later, another notice appeared, this one claiming his bird feeder was attracting vermin and must be removed within 48 hours. By Friday, a third violation arrived stating his lawn exceeded the maximum height by 1/4 inch with a $75 fine attached. Thomas's doorbell camera, installed after the second notice, captured Margaret herself measuring his grass at 5:30 that morning, ruler in hand, her silver Mercedes idling at the curb. "This is getting ridiculous," Thomas muttered as he wrote a check for the fine. While collecting his mail that afternoon, Thomas noticed his mailman watching him with sympathy. "Trouble with the HOA?" the postal worker asked, gesturing to the violation notice Thomas held. "How did you guess?" Thomas replied with a wry smile. "I've been delivering mail here for 17 years, the man said, leaning closer. "You're not the first, you know. The last family in your house moved after 6 months of what they called HOA harassment. Nice young couple with kids. Shame, really." Thomas's smile faded. "The previous owners left because of the HOA. That's the pattern with your house," the mailman continued, glancing around before speaking further. "Great property, but nobody stays long. Always the same story. Constant violations, rising fines. Some folks just can't take the pressure." As the mail truck pulled away, Thomas stared at his beautiful corner lot with new understanding. This wasn't random enforcement, it was targeted. The question was, "I've been watching what's happening to you," whispered an unexpected voice, as Thomas selected tomatoes at the local farmer's market. He turned to find an elegant older woman observing him with bright, intelligent eyes. "I'm sorry," Thomas replied, unsure if he should recognize her. "Eleanor Fairchild," she said, extending a wrinkled hand adorned with a vintage emerald ring. "I live in the Victorian at the entrance to Willowbrook. I've been there since before they even had an HOA." Thomas shook her hand, recalling the meticulously maintained blue Victorian with the wraparound porch. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Fairchild." "Eleanor, please," she corrected, leading closer. "Margaret did the same to the Richardsons before you, and the Mendozas before them. Your corner lot is special, you see." Thomas froze, a tomato suspended in his hand. "What do you mean?" Eleanor glanced around the crowded market. "Not here. Too many years. Come for tea tomorrow, 3 o'clock. The following afternoon, Thomas found himself on Eleanor's porch, surrounded by flourishing plants that would certainly violate multiple HOA regulations. She welcomed him into a home filled with antiques and photographs, spanning decades of Willowbrook history. "I've lived here 62 years, Eleanor explained, pouring tea into delicate china cups. "I've watched developers come and go, seen their tactics change, but never their intentions." She spread a collection of neighborhood maps and property records across her dining table. Some were yellowed with age, others freshly printed from county databases. "Look at the pattern," she instructed, her finger tracing a series of highlighted properties. These corner lots were all purchased by different entities between 2010 and 2018. Different company names, but follow the paperwork and they lead to the same place. Thomas leaned closer, studying the documents. "Pinnacle Development. Margaret's husband's company," Eleanor confirmed, tapping a newspaper clipping featuring a smiling couple at a charity gala. "James Winters, CEO. She never discloses this at meetings, which violates state HOA regulations about conflicts of interest." Thomas frowned, processing this information. But why target specific properties? What's special about the corners? Eleanor smiled, impressed by his question. "Zoning," she replied, revealing another map. "Corner lots in Willowbrook sit on the boundaries between residential and mixed-use zoning. With enough adjoining parcels, a developer could petition for rezoning and build multi-unit housing or commercial properties." She pointed to Thomas's lot on the map. "Your property connects 2 sections they already control. It's the missing piece of their puzzle." Thomas stared at the documents, his mind racing. This isn't about garden beds or grass height. It's about forcing you out to complete a multi-million-dollar real estate scheme, Eleanor finished. They've used the same playbook before. Selective enforcement, escalating fines, creating a hostile living situation, until the owner sells from frustration. Thomas sat back, stunned by the revelation. Why are you telling me this? Eleanor's eyes hardened. Because I'm tired of watching good neighbors driven away. Because Willowbrook was a community before it became an investment opportunity. And because, she added with a mischievous smile, I've been documenting these patterns for years, waiting for someone stubborn enough to fight back. When Thomas left Eleanor's house, the evening sun cast long shadows across the neighborhood. He noticed details he previously missed, a Pinnacle development sign on a vacant lot nearby, featuring a rendering of luxury townhomes, remarkably similar to Margaret's own residence. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, revealing a picture far bigger than garden beds and bird feeders. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. His mind raced with questions about property rights, predatory practices, and how many families had been pushed from their homes before him. By dawn, his confusion had crystallized into something more powerful: determination. Thomas transformed his home office into an investigation headquarters, walls lined with property records, HOA bylaws, and state regulations. A large map of Willowbrook Estates dominated the center, with color-coded pins marking properties connected to Pinnacle development. Yellow sticky notes chronicled violations issued to each home, revealing a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. His research revealed that selective enforcement of rules violated state property laws, and Margaret's undisclosed financial interest constituted a serious conflict of interest. When David stopped by to borrow a ladder, he stared at the evidence wall with widening eyes. "You've been busy," David remarked, taking in the detailed timeline of HOA decisions affecting corner properties. "Knowledge is power," Thomas replied, handing him a document. "Did you know state law requires HOA board members to disclose business relationships that might influence their decisions?" David scanned the legal statute. Margaret never mentioned her husband's development company. "Exactly," Thomas said, "and that's just the beginning." Rather than confronting Margaret directly, Thomas began hosting Friday evening gatherings, casual backyard affairs, with neighbors who gradually shared their own experiences with puzzling restrictions and denials. He kept the focus on building community, carefully avoiding any mention of his investigation. The first gathering drew only David and his wife, plus an older couple from across the street. By the third week, 15 neighbors crowded his patio, sharing stories over homemade lemonade and grilled appetizers. "They rejected our solar panel application 3 times, explained Jason Rodriguez, standing beside his partner Miguel. "Each time with a different reason. But the Andersons on Maple have solar panels," someone pointed out. "Mrs. Anderson is Margaret's cousin," another neighbor interjected, raising eyebrows around the group. Thomas quietly documented each story, building a comprehensive picture of HOA enforcement patterns. Jason and Miguel had been prevented from installing solar panels, despite explicit state laws protecting renewable energy improvements. The Thompsons received weekly fines for their son's basketball hoop, identical to the one in Margaret's own grandson's driveway. On Wednesday afternoons, Thomas met with Eleanor, whose decades of record-keeping proved invaluable. She introduced him to former residents who had sold their properties after experiencing similar treatment. "The Mendozas held out for almost a year," explained a former neighbor who had moved to the next town. "They had 3 young children and couldn't handle the stress of constant violations." Thomas connected with a real estate attorney who reviewed his evidence with widened eyes. "This is textbook predatory HOA behavior," the attorney said, tapping Thomas's binder of documentation. "The selective enforcement alone violates state law, but the undisclosed financial interest takes this to another level." The attorney helped draft carefully worded letters citing specific legal statutes that Thomas hand-delivered to each board member except Margaret. His note included documentation of their personal liability if they knowingly participated in discriminatory practices. Meanwhile, Margaret escalated her campaign, sending landscapers to aggressively prune the privacy hedge between their properties without notice. Thomas documented the damage with photographs and a certified arborist's assessment of the improper cutting. As his investigation deepened, Thomas discovered a planning commission application filed by Pinnacle Development. The proposal, scheduled for review the following month, included a vague reference to assembled parcels in the Willowbrook region. with renderings showing luxury condominiums, where single-family homes currently stood. When Margaret filed a formal complaint about the excessive visitor parking during Thomas's increasingly popular neighborhood gatherings, he simply moved his car to make room for more guests. Each week, new neighbors arrived, curious about the growing sense of community of the house that had changed hands so frequently before. "You know she's watching," David whispered as they grilled burgers for 20 neighbors one Saturday evening. Thomas smiled, waving to the security camera he had spotted in Margaret's upstairs window. "I'm counting on it." The annual HOA meeting required a venue change to accommodate unprecedented attendance. Instead of the usual 20 or 30 residents, nearly 200 homeowners packed the community center, creating a buzz of anticipation. Thomas arrived early, calmly setting up a professional presentation, including drone footage comparing selectively enforced property violations. Eleanor entered with the assistance of her grandson, taking a seat in the front row. One by one, residents who had attended Thomas's gatherings filtered in, nodding to him with quiet solidarity. Board members arrived looking uneasy, glancing at the unusually large crowd. Margaret entered wearing a crisp white suit, faltering mid-stride at the sight of Eleanor. She quickly composed herself, arranging her papers at the center of the table with practiced precision. "Let's call this meeting to order," Margaret announced, striking her gavel with authority. "We have a full agenda tonight, so we'll need to keep things moving efficiently." She attempted to rush through standard reports and budget approvals, clearly hoping to minimize open discussion. When she announced they would postpone the public comment section due to time constraints, Board Treasurer Richard Steinman unexpectedly intervened. "Point of order, Madam President," he said, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Our bylaws require public comment at annual meetings. I move we address the documents delivered to board members last week." Margaret's smile tightened. "What documents are you referring to?" "The legal analysis regarding selective enforcement and conflicts of interest," Richard replied, avoiding her gaze. All board members received copies. The room fell silent as Thomas walked to the podium, carrying a slim portfolio. He spoke calmly, his voice steady as he addressed the packed room. "Good evening," he began. "My name is Thomas Jenkins. I've been a Willowbrook resident for 7 months, though many families who previously owned my home didn't last that long." Thomas presented evidence of Margaret's undisclosed financial interests, displaying county records connecting her to Pinnacle Development. He showed the pattern of targeted enforcement, with striking before and after photos of corner properties that had been sold following periods of intensive violations. "State law requires HOA board members to disclose conflicts of interest," he explained, displaying the legal statutes on screen. Pinnacle Development's ownership of surrounding properties represents precisely such a conflict. The collective gasped when he revealed Margaret's husband as Pinnacle's CEO seemed to physically shift the room's atmosphere. He finished by showing the recently filed development application that would replace several corner lots with multi-unit housing. "Many of you received selective enforcement notices," Thomas concluded. "Some of you sold your homes because of them. None of us were told that our properties were being targeted as part of a coordinated development strategy." Board members exchanged alarmed glances as Margaret's composure crumbled. "This is a personal attack," she declared, rising from her chair. "Mr. Jenkins is new to our community and doesn't understand our standards." Her protest withered as Eleanor Fairchild stood up, leaning on her cane. "I've lived here 62 years," Eleanor announced, her voice carrying surprising strength. "Long enough to recognize the difference between building a community and building a real estate portfolio." The emergency election that followed was unprecedented in Willowbrook history. Margaret and 2 loyal board members were removed by overwhelming majority vote, replaced by a committee tasked with revising bylaws and ensuring transparent enforcement. By midsummer, Thomas's garden flourished with heirloom tomatoes and vibrant peppers. Neighbors regularly stopped by for gardening tips and fresh vegetables. The revised HOA newsletter featured his tomatoes on the cover, alongside an article about the community's new commitment to fairness and property rights. The structures, once deemed violations, had become symbols of the neighborhood's renewal. Thomas hosted the season's first community potluck in his backyard, where Richard Steinman, now serving as interim HOA president, raised the toast. "To neighbors looking out for neighbors," Richard said, as glasses clinked in the summer twilight. Margaret's house listed for sale the following week. Thomas planted extra cucumber seedlings to welcome whatever neighbor might arrive next, confident they would stay longer than their predecessors.